Hello everyone, and welcome to my discussion on interpersonal and organizational communication, where we're mastering the exchange of information in our organizations. Now, how good a communicator do you think that you currently are? There was a survey done of about 400 U.S. employers and a little over 600 college students, and this survey revealed that more than 80% of employers and around 75% of students believe that oral and written communication skills are very important for workplace success. However, while more than 60% of students reported that they were skilled in oral and written communication, only about 27% of employers truly endorsed this conclusion. What's that say? That says that while graduates think they can communicate well, when they get into the workforce, it's quickly found out that they cannot. So as you're continuing your studies, let's focus on your communication skills and bettering them so that once you enter the workforce, you don't fall into that line of where your employer does not feel that you are a good communicator. And when it comes to communication, we also think about the communication process, and we'll talk about the communication process here shortly, but are you an efficient communicator? Are you an effective communicator? And are hopefully you both effective and efficient? Someone may be very efficient in sending a group of people a reprimand by email, or like we saw here recently in 2022 or 2021, a employer decided to dismiss 900 employees via a Zoom conference call. That was quite efficient, but it was not very effective. Make sure that you understand the difference between being effective and being efficient. It may not be effective if it makes everyone angry so that they cannot absorb the meaning of the communication that you're trying to send. And that leads us into the communication process. So make sure you understand this process. When it comes to the communication process, which starts with what is communication? Well, communication is the transfer of information and understanding from one person to another. You can see I've got that process outlined here, and that the communication process involves, very simply, the sender, the person who encodes a message and selects whatever medium used to get the message, which is the second part of the communication, the actual message, how that's transmitted, that's the medium, and it's only effective if the receiver, the intended audience of the message, actually receives the message and is able to decode the message to understand the meaning of the sender. Well, how do we really understand if the message has been received? Well, usually there's some type of feedback. So it can be nonverbal expression, it can be verbal expression. Going beyond this image that I've shared here, it could be that a follow-up email is sent back to the sender if the sender was using email as a medium of communication. As managers, we need to tailor our communication to the appropriate medium for the appropriate situation. I mentioned about being efficient and effective. Now, you are an efficient communicator when you can transmit your message accurately in the least time. You're an effective communicator when your intended message is accurately understood by the other person or the receiver. Unfortunately, the entire communication process can be disrupted at several different points in the communication process by what we call noise. And noise is just any disturbance that interferes with the transmission of a message. It can occur at many different stages. It can occur in the encoding or the decoding, as when people from different cultures stumble over each other's languages. Even within our own languages, we have some noise, such as jargon. Jargon is just terminology that's specific to a particular profession or group, or it can be jargon within the culture. And I mentioned nonverbal communication. Noise can also occur in this nonverbal communication when our physical movements and our words send, different messages than what we intend. Formal communication channels follow the chain of command, which is of 3 different types, and I've got those listed here: vertical, horizontal, and external. Vertical, this is meaning that up and down communication. Horizontal means laterally or sideways, like from one department to another or from one coworker to others. And then external means, obviously, communication outside of the organization. Make sure you understand these types of formal communication channels that exist in our organizations. Informal communication channels, these develop outside the organization's overall formal structure of communication. These informal communication channels are more spontaneous. They can skip the various management levels and they can cut across any type of lines of authority that exist. And there are really two types of informal communication that I want to address, and that's the grapevine, or that unofficial communication system of our informal organizations, and face-to-face. With face-to-face, this is where employees value authentic human time with their actual boss or their supervisor or their manager. With face-to-face communication, this builds trust and depends heavily on the manager's effective listening skills. And FaceTime is going to build relationships and trust, show respect for employees as individuals, and thus is very highly motivating. As managers, you should make the most out of any time you have for face-to-face communication, any opportunity you have for face-to-face communication. Rather than hoping to catch people at random, make sure you schedule time with the individual employees and make sure you'll both be free of any type of distractions, especially with smartphones, for those most minutes of your meeting. Another thing to keep in mind here is this is not a moment for you to multitask. Let your focus be on the communication with your subordinate. And listen not just to the words that the other person is saying, but also to the emotional content behind the words. Definitely make eye contact and observe their body language. This is going to help you be empathetic, and we've talked about empathy before. And when it's your turn to speak, be brief. Don't just talk to talk. If your message is specific or fact-based, prepare your facts and outline your thoughts ahead of the time that you're going to have that one-on-one face-to-face meeting. Expect questions and make sure that you're prepared to answer those questions. For in-person meetings with groups of employees, you might hear the term called a town hall meeting. These are often going to be held monthly or quarterly, whatever your organization has set as a standard. Or if they haven't, it's up to you to do that. But these usually consist of a presentation by managers and an open Q&A or question and answer session with the employees. Make sure to be available for informal conversations with individuals after that town hall meeting is over with. These are a great way for people to be able to communicate with their subordinates as a group. You can achieve FaceTime even if your employees work remotely. So don't think that virtual workers don't value that face-to-face communication for that informal communication. Use things like webcasts or video conferencing software or some type of social media portal to be able to keep those communications direct and very personal with those virtual employees. Managers spend a great deal of time in meetings, and most of them will probably say we spend too much time in meetings. In fact, mid-level managers average more than 20 meetings every given week, and workers reportedly judge nearly 50% of those meetings to be a complete waste of time, something that could have been accomplished through email and not taking their time away from their duties. Productive meetings are going to be short. They're going to be held in convenient locations away from various distractions and attended by only the people who will be most directly affected by decisions made and, who can contribute most usefully to the problem solutions. It's all too often that when it comes to a meeting, everybody gets requested or told that they need to be at the meeting, even if the meeting is of no value to them and they cannot bring any type of contribution to the meeting. This happens so often, and we lose so much time and productivity due to this type of poor management, poor leadership when it comes to meetings. And it's just because they've been a part of so many, and for some reason they have this misguided nature that if everyone's there, even if they don't need to be, at least they have the information. That's not always the case. We hire people to do jobs, and we need to make sure they can do those jobs and not waste their time and efforts by having them in meetings that they are of no value to, and the meeting is of no value to them. So let's talk about how to streamline our meetings. As a meeting leader, make sure to share the agenda at least a day ahead of time with those that are going to be attending. Another thing is to be the first to arrive at the meeting if at all possible. Stick to the time limits that you've set, and stick to the agenda, and if there's any kind of unproductive discussion that spurs at some time during the meeting, gently but firmly cut that off. Keep the meeting on track. Another thing is that people focus better during meetings of an hour or less, and definitely usually less. People's attention spans are only so long, and we want to make sure that we are not keeping them away from their duties as well. And then, if possible, send a summary or a follow-up to kind of recap the to-do list within about 24 hours of that meeting, so that everyone knows exactly if there were any tasks assigned to them or if there are some follow-up items that need to be addressed. Now, if you're a participant for a meeting, make sure to read that agenda. Prepare any facts or data that you are supposed to furnish, and then, I can't emphasize this enough, make sure that your phone is set to vibrate or the ringer is off so that you are not distracted. You're getting the message of the communication that's occurring. As a participant, you should expect to contribute to the meeting, but make sure that your contributions are brief, they're professional, and you're not just contributing to contribute. Lastly, if you came away from the meeting with a to-do list, obviously be sure you can act on it in a very timely way. Let's talk about barriers to communication. I'm going to list some of these. All it takes is one block step in our overall communication process for that communication to fail. So I've listed some barriers here that happen within our communication process. There's the send barrier. If a manager has an idea but is afraid to voice it because he or she fears criticism, then obviously no message gets sent. So that's a problem with the sender. Maybe there's a problem with the encoding of it. So if people have a different first language, let's say, the meaning of the words can be misinterpreted. Maybe it's a problem with the medium. Let's say your computer network is down. The network is an example of a blocked medium. The message cannot get sent to the receiver. Maybe I talked about encoding. Maybe there's a problem with the decoding of the message. Let's say you pulled an all-nighter traveling back from a long trip, and today your brain's a little fuzzy and you're unfocused during a meeting. That is a decoding barrier. There's also a receiver barrier. Because you were texting during the meeting, let's say, you thought you were trying to make some plans or something like that with something outside of work. Well, obviously you weren't listening when something was announced, and you have some expectations to complete tomorrow. That's on you. That's the receiver barrier. And the feedback barrier. You give someone driving directions, let's say, but since they kind of only nod their heads to kind of acknowledge that they understand, and they aren't able to repeat those directions back to you, you don't really know whether or not they actually understood those directions because of that feedback barrier. You didn't get actually effective feedback. Here's some other barriers we talk about. We've got physical barriers, sound, time, space. These are physical barriers that could occur that affect your communication process. We also have personal barriers, and these could include things in the communication skills or processing and interpreting information, maybe trustworthiness or credibility. Things like oversized egos are another personal barrier. Maybe your pride, that could be a barrier as well. Self-esteem, arrogance, your listening skills, judgment of others, even generational considerations can all be personal barriers. Now, cross-cultural barriers are a greater challenge as more jobs include interactions with others around the world. Culture naturally affects the way we communicate. Language barriers often exist. Nonverbal signs and symbols, they can have different meanings in different cultures. And then nonverbal communications. These can present a barrier if it conflicts with the spoken message. Nonverbal communication consists of, messages sent outside of the written or the spoken word. We primarily express nonverbal communication through making eye contact or our facial expressions, even some of our body movements and gestures. Even touch is one way that we express nonverbal communication. Some research has suggested that over 55% of what we communicate is transmitted nonverbally. And then lastly, we do have, gender differences that can also present barriers that can be overcome. Social media management. If you're living in the 21st century, you know what social media is. It's web-based and mobile technologies that generate interactive dialogue with various members of that network. These technologies allow business managers to reach and interact with customers and potential employees in new ways. The widespread use of social media is changing our personal lives and the very nature of how businesses operate and the principles of management. We discussed social media and their uses by employees and managers. We're also looking at the impact of how social media has on we as managers, our organization's effectiveness, and the way we recruit, our productivity, if we're being innovative, lots of different characteristics of how social media has an impact on our organizations and us as managers. A term I wanted to talk about, could be new to you, but there's a lot of costs of social media use. And one of those is the effects of cyberloafing. And cyberloafing is just where employees are accessing the internet at work in whatever media they're using. And it's not for work purposes, it's for personal use. So they're loafing on the job, and they are doing this through the internet. That's why it's called cyberloafing. Some studies are going to put the cost of cyberloafing very high, where we're looking at, we're not looking at thousands of dollars a year. We're looking at about $85 billion per year here in the U.S. is the cost to businesses for cyberloafing. We have different software tools that we can employ that can reduce cyberloafing, like limiting access or even the length of time that people are doing work on the internet that's not based on their job. And as IT professionals, we put a lot of work into place where we are blocking sites or different types of content on the browsers. We're putting different rules or protocols in place to help with this, but we can only do so much. And with, people bringing their smartphones to work and being on those all the time, that's another area where we have to focus on. And you will find that some organizations are actually implementing various smartphone policies because of the effects of cyberloafing. The way we say things impacts the way as a message is going to be received. For example, using absolutes like always or never is very likely to create a defensive response. Try to avoid using absolutes because they are rarely true. You can instead increase your communication competence by avoiding the defensive antecedents and employing the positive ones of non-defensive communication. Another thing is empathy. When we want to be empathetic or when we want to be effective, we can use empathy. Empathy works for managers because it is not the same thing as uncritically accepting others' words and behaviors. Rather, it's going to rely on your conscious effort to understand that emotional impact of our words and our behaviors. Remember, empathy is that ability to recognize and understand someone else's feelings and their thoughts. And when you can do this, that is going to foster having that open communication. Whatever you do, continue to work on your skills throughout life so that you're becoming a more effective writer, a more effective listener, and a more effective speaker. There's a lot that we do every day in the organizations that starts and ends with that interpersonal and organizational communication. So make sure your skills are what your employer deserves. Just because you communicate one way on your phone or through social media apps with your friends or even those acquaintances that you've never met, that's not the same type of communication you need to have as a professional in an organization. So make sure you leave those skills at the door. Matter of fact, the best you can do to remove those skills and make more professional skills, the better you're going to be at communication, and the better your feelings from your employer are going to be in your ability to communicate within and outside of the organization. So make sure to keep working on those skills, everyone. Take care.